My name was Emily Grayson, and I was 42 years old when I walked into the courtroom and said, "It was me." No one knew that the real culprit was sitting in the front row, hiding her eyes. She was my twin sister. I did it for her children so they wouldn't lose their mother. I took someone else's guilt upon myself, and from that day on my life no longer belonged to me. But the years in prison could not erase the truth I carried inside me like a secret scar. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name was Emily Grayson, and I was 42 years old when the course of my life shifted forever. I had been working as a bookkeeper in a small insurance office in Columbus, Ohio, where numbers and receipts filled my days and quiet evenings defined my nights. I lived in a modest apartment with beige walls and thin carpets, a place that never smelled of more than instant coffee and paper stacks. My life was plain, even dull to some, but it was steady. Steady until the night my sister arrived at my door. Linda was my twin in appearance but never in spirit. Where I was careful, she was reckless. Where I saved, she borrowed. Where I avoided risk, she leapt into it with both feet, often dragging chaos behind her. I had spent much of my adulthood cleaning up her messes, soothing creditors, covering bills, and stepping in when her impulses threatened to destroy everything. I had done it out of love, out of obligation, out of the strange tether that binds twins even when logic tells you to walk away. But that night was different. That night was not another overdue bill or another plea for a ride home. She stood trembling on my threshold, her hair tangled, her makeup streaked down her cheeks, her hands clutching at her sweater as though fabric alone could hold her together. I had never seen her like that. Her eyes darted past me into the apartment, scanning the corners like a hunted animal. When she finally stepped inside, she carried with her a chill that did not belong to the December air outside. It was a chill born of something far darker. I closed the door behind her, and the silence stretched so long I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Her lips moved, but no words came. Then, in a hoarse whisper, she said what had already begun to form in my gut before she even spoke. There had been a fight, a man's anger, her rage, words thrown like knives, a shove, a strike, and then silence. The silence of a body no longer moving, a chest no longer rising. She had killed him, not with intention, she said, but with heat, with fury, with the wild energy that had defined her entire life. I sat down heavily on the edge of the couch, my hands numb. Her words filled the room, thick and suffocating. I could see it play out in my mind. The argument, the flash of violence, the stillness afterward. I could see her two children sleeping in the next room of her small house when it happened, unaware that their world had cracked open in the middle of the night. I thought of their faces, their small hands, their school drawings taped to the fridge. That was the moment when the decision began to take shape. It did not arrive with clarity, not with courage, but with the heavy dread of inevitability. I had no husband, no children, no one who would collapse without me. She had two children who would be swallowed by the foster system if she went to prison. They would be scattered like leaves in the wind, carrying scars before their childhoods had even settled. I thought of them growing up with strangers, calling someone else mother, forgetting the shape of her face. I remember walking to the bathroom and looking into the mirror. My own reflection stared back at me, tired eyes framed by dark hair streaked with gray, a face that had always been mistaken for hers. In that reflection, I saw not myself, but the chance to save them, to save her children from a world of loss. The logic twisted inside me, part sacrifice, part desperation. I told myself I could endure what she could not. I had the strength to bend, to break, to bear it all. She had the children, and they needed her more than anyone would ever need me. When I returned to the living room, she sat curled into herself, rocking slightly, muttering about how she had ruined everything. I placed my hand on her shoulder, though the weight of it felt more like finality than comfort. I heard myself say words that I did not even know I was capable of speaking. I told her I would take the blame. I told her I would stand in her place. She looked up at me with eyes wide and wet, disbelief mingled with relief, and in that moment I felt the chain lock around my own neck. The hours that followed blurred into a kind of ritual. I rehearsed the story I would tell. I planned how to walk into the police station, how to let the words, "It was me," leave my mouth with conviction. I thought of the questions they would ask, the evidence they would gather, the files they would stack with my name across the front. Every detail was a nail in the coffin of my old life. I barely slept that night. I lay on the couch while she paced, and I listened to the sound of her children breathing in the other room. That sound became the anchor that held me to my decision. Each soft exhale was a reminder of why I would give myself away. The hours crawled until morning, when gray light filtered through the blinds and painted stripes across the carpet. By then, my resolve was no longer something to debate. It was carved into me. When I finally stood and picked up my coat, the weight of the fabric on my shoulders felt like the weight of years I had not yet lived. I kissed her children on their foreheads as they slept, whispering a goodbye they would never remember. Then I walked out the door, each step on the frozen sidewalk ringing with finality. I knew that nothing about my life would ever return to the quiet balance I once had. I knew that when I confessed, the world would see me differently, would mark me forever. But I also knew that I could not turn back. I had chosen to carry the burden of her act, to trade my freedom for the illusion of theirs. That was the decision that changed everything. It was not noble, not pure, not clean. It was heavy, complicated, poisoned by fear and bound by love. And as I walked toward the police station, my breath clouding in the cold air, I felt the line between before and after vanish beneath my feet. My life was no longer my own. It belonged to the sacrifice I had chosen, and to the secret I would carry for years behind bars. The day I entered the courtroom, the world outside seemed impossibly distant, as though I had stepped into another dimension where time moved differently and air itself grew heavier. The courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, a mixture that carried the weight of countless lives judged before mine. I walked through the doors with my head bowed, the click of my shoes echoing across the marble floor, each sound announcing my presence to strangers who would soon decide my fate. The courtroom itself was not grand, but to me it might as well have been a cathedral of power. The judge's bench towered above, elevated as if to remind us all that his word carried the weight of eternity. The state seal gleamed above his chair, polished and indifferent. Wooden pews stretched across the gallery where people sat in silence, their eyes resting on me in ways I could not endure for long. Their gazes burned with curiosity, suspicion, and judgment. I did not see sympathy. I did not expect it. I sat at the defendant's table, my hands folded tightly together in my lap. The cuffs had been removed, but the marks they left on my wrists seemed etched into my skin. My lawyer, assigned to me by the state, shuffled papers with the distracted air of someone already weary before the battle began. He wore a suit that had seen too many seasons, his tie crooked, his voice hushed when he leaned to murmur instructions I barely heard. His presence was meant to shield me, but I felt no shield, only the thin veil of protocol. The prosecutor rose, his voice strong and commanding, filling every corner of the room. He recited the facts as though they were scripture, each word sharpened into an arrow aimed at my chest. He spoke of violence, of intent, of responsibility. He painted a portrait of me as someone dangerous, deliberate, a woman who had crossed the line between anger and murder. His gestures were precise, his tone dripping with confidence. The jury nodded along, their eyes fixed on him, their pens scratching across notepads. I felt my throat tighten. My own lawyer offered little resistance, only brief questions that seemed to dissipate into the air before they reached the judge's ears. He lacked fire, lacked the force to counter the narrative being built against me. I understood in that moment that my story would not be told, that my silence would be mistaken for guilt, that my sacrifice would be consumed by the machinery of law without question. I looked once toward the gallery. She was there, my sister. Linda sat stiffly in the second row, her hands clasped so tightly together they looked bloodless. Her eyes never met mine. She stared at the floor, at her lap, at anything but me. The children were not with her. Perhaps that was mercy, or perhaps she feared what their eyes might reveal if they looked at me. In that instant, a wave of sorrow surged through me so strong I thought I might collapse. I wanted her to look at me, to acknowledge the weight I had taken onto my shoulders, but she sat motionless, consumed by her own silence. The judge listened with an expression carved from stone. His gavel rested within reach, his glasses perched low on his nose, his face betraying nothing. He asked questions only to clarify procedure, never to probe deeper. I knew my fate rested less in his hands than in the slow nods of the jury, strangers who saw only the story told by the prosecutor and reinforced by my lawyer's absence of fight. When it was my turn to stand, the room grew still. My voice shook as I confirmed my plea, repeating words rehearsed but hollow. Each syllable fell into the air like lead, final and irreversible. I did not cry. I did not shout. I simply stood there, a shadow of myself, repeating lines in a script I had chosen, though no one else in that room knew the truth of why. The jury filed out at the end of testimony, their faces unreadable. I sat there with my heart pounding, counting the seconds that felt like hours. When they returned, their verdict came swiftly. Guilty. The word hung in the air, vibrating through my bones, sealing the path I had chosen the night I promised myself to her children. The sentencing followed, the judge's voice even and detached as he recited the years I would spend behind bars. The words blurred into one long droning hum, but the number struck me like a blow. I tried to steady my breathing, gripping the edge of the table until my knuckles whitened. I reminded myself over and over that this was for them, for the children who slept innocently that night, unaware of the bargain their aunt had made. As the bailiff stepped forward to lead me away, I allowed myself one final glance toward the gallery. Linda's eyes were wet now, though whether from guilt or grief I could not tell. She finally looked at me, just for a fleeting second, and in that second I saw everything: fear, shame, dependence. Then she looked away again, and I was escorted through the side door into the shadowed corridors of the courthouse, where the air smelled of bleach and old dust. The door closed behind me with a metallic clang, and I knew the line between freedom and captivity had been crossed. The courtroom had finished its work. My life had been stripped down to a number, a file, a sentence carved into stone. I had chosen this path, and now it belonged to me alone. The first thing I noticed when the gates clanged shut behind me was the smell. It clung to the air like an unwelcome guest. Bleach, sweat, overcooked food, and something metallic, like rust. The prison was not simply a building of walls and bars. It was a living thing, breathing in despair and exhaling resignation. I had stepped into its lungs, and from the very first breath, I felt it seeping into me. My cell was a narrow rectangle of cinder blocks, painted an unconvincing shade of cream that only highlighted the cracks in the corners. The bunk pressed against the wall sagged in the middle, the mattress thin as cardboard, its cover torn in places that revealed yellowed foam. A small metal sink jutted out beside the toilet, both fixtures stained by years of use, their surfaces dulled by endless scrubbing that never made them clean. Above it all was a tiny window, with bars thick enough to block even the illusion of escape. The sky through that slit of glass looked like it belonged to another world entirely. The sound never stopped. Doors slammed, keys rattled, guards barked orders down the corridor. The hum of fluorescent lights filled every silence. Even in the rare moments when voices fell quiet, the building itself seemed to groan, as though the weight of so many broken lives strained its foundations. I lay awake those first nights, listening to the symphony of confinement, the coughing of women down the hall, the sobs muffled into pillows, the rhythmic pacing of restless feet on concrete. Routine became my captor more than the bars. Each morning began with the clanging of metal, the demand to rise, the shuffle of bodies moving toward breakfast. Trays of food slid across counters, pale eggs that tasted of nothing, oatmeal so thick it stuck to the spoon, coffee that resembled dirty water. We ate quickly, not from hunger, but because lingering made you vulnerable to glares and words better left unsaid. The cafeteria echoed with chatter, but beneath it ran an undercurrent of tension, an unspoken agreement that peace was fragile, always ready to break. Work assignments followed. I was sent to the laundry, where the air was heavy with steam and detergent. My hands grew raw from folding uniforms, still hot from the dryers, the fabric stiff and scratchy against my skin. There was comfort in the repetition, though, in the way my body moved without thought, in the way time passed unnoticed when my hands stayed busy. Folding became a kind of meditation, a way to silence the noise in my head. But even there, even in the monotony, I carried the knowledge that I was doing this for something I had not done, that every sheet I stacked was payment for a debt that was not mine. I learned quickly to keep to myself. Conversations could be traps. Secrets were currency, and too much honesty made you a target. I spoke little, listened much, and allowed silence to be my companion. There were women who shouted to assert themselves, who carved out power with fists or words sharp as knives. There were others who disappeared into shadows, their faces pale, their eyes hollow, their bodies moving like ghosts. I floated somewhere between, careful not to be noticed too much, careful not to vanish entirely. The guards treated us as interchangeable parts of a machine. Their eyes were tired, their voices clipped. To them, I was not Emily Grayson, a woman with a story and a choice that had ruined her life. I was simply inmate, number, case. They called us by last names, never first, stripping even the smallest intimacy from our existence. Each time they barked Grayson, it was a reminder of who I had become, or rather, what I had been reduced to. Nights were the worst. The lights dimmed but never went out completely. Shadows stretched across the walls, broken by the bars of the door. I lay on the thin mattress, staring upward, chasing sleep that rarely came. In those hours, memories flooded me with no mercy. I thought of my desk back at the office, the way the adding machine clicked as I tapped the numbers. I thought of the smell of fresh coffee from the corner diner I used to visit on Saturdays. Most of all, I thought of her, my sister, and the children whose small faces I had sworn to protect. Their laughter was only in my memory now, yet it cut deeper than any silence in the prison. Seasons shifted outside, though I experienced them only in slivers through the barred window. I knew it was winter when the air coming through the cracks turned sharp, when I wrapped myself in the thin blanket and still shivered. I knew it was spring when I heard birds faintly at dawn, their songs carrying into a place that tried to smother all beauty. Summer came with suffocating heat that made the air thick, and autumn with the scent of damp leaves I could almost imagine. The world moved on, marking time, while inside the walls time stood still. There were moments of small humanity. A woman pressed half a cookie into my palm one afternoon, no words exchanged. Another shared a scrap of paper when she saw me staring at the walls too long, as if she knew I needed to write, even if it was only to myself. These gestures were fragile threads, weaving a net that kept me from collapsing entirely. They reminded me that even here, surrounded by concrete and despair, traces of kindness survived. But always, the truth returned. I was here for her crime. Each time I heard a guard call my name, each time I folded another uniform, each time I traced the cracks in the cinder blocks with my eyes, I knew that my sacrifice had built this cage. The walls did not care about the reason, did not distinguish between guilt and innocence, between choice and chance. They only held me, pressed in on me, reminded me that I belonged to them now. Inside those walls, I became both prisoner and witness. I watched myself transform into someone harder, quieter, shaped by confinement. I felt the edges of my old self wear away, replaced by something leaner, something built for endurance. The walls did not simply contain me, they remade me. And as the days stretched into months, and months blurred into years, I understood that the woman who had walked into that courtroom was gone. In her place stood someone else entirely, someone forged inside the walls. The letters began to arrive a few months after my sentence started. Thin envelopes passed into my hands during mail call, each one bearing the familiar handwriting of my sister. The first time I saw my name scrawled across the front, my knees nearly buckled. For a moment I clutched it against my chest, afraid to open it, afraid of what words might spill out. In a place where every day felt the same, those letters became a pulse from the outside world, proof that life still moved beyond the walls, even if mine had stopped. The paper always smelled faintly of her house, laundry detergent mixed with the faint scent of cooking oil, the traces of a life I once knew. She wrote about the children, how they were doing in school, how they were growing taller, learning new words, making friends. She described small victories, like when her son won a ribbon at a spelling bee, or when her daughter learned how to ride a bike without falling. The details painted vivid pictures in my mind, so sharp they almost hurt to imagine. I could see their faces as though they stood before me, but the truth was I had missed it all. Every milestone reached without me was a quiet reminder of the years slipping away. She often wrote apologies woven into the fabric of her updates. They appeared between the lines, tucked into sentences that tried to sound casual. She would write that she was trying to do better, that she was keeping her life together for the children's sake. I could read her guilt in the way she over-explained, in the way her handwriting shook across the page. Each letter from her carried two voices, the voice of a mother trying to assure me the children were safe, and the voice of a sister haunted by the knowledge that her freedom was built on my captivity. Sometimes the children included drawings, crayon houses with smiling stick figures under the sun, a dog with a crooked tail, a rainbow stretching across the page. They signed their names in uneven letters, proud of their work. The first time I held one of those drawings, I pressed it against the wall beside my bunk, smoothing it out as though it were sacred. Yet there was always something missing. The houses had three figures: mother, son, daughter, never a fourth, never me. I had been erased from their world, not out of cruelty, but out of the natural forgetting that comes when a figure disappears from daily life. I read and reread every letter until the edges curled and the ink began to fade. I traced the words with my finger, memorizing the rhythm of her sentences, the way she looped her letters, the pauses she left where emotion must have stopped her pen. At night, when the noise of the prison swelled, I clutched the papers to my chest and pretended her voice carried me to another place. Yet the comfort always soured with bitterness. Each word reminded me of what I had lost, what I had given up, what I had agreed to carry so she could continue her life. There were times when no letters came for weeks. I would stand in line during mail call, heart pounding, only to walk away empty-handed. The absence of an envelope felt like a punishment sharper than any guard's command. I would sit on my bunk staring at the wall, wondering if she had forgotten me, if the guilt had grown too heavy for her to keep writing. But eventually, another letter would arrive, and I would exhale as though I had been holding my breath the entire time. Not every letter brought comfort. Some carried a weight that nearly crushed me. She wrote about bills, about sickness, about the struggles of raising two children alone. She wrote about moments when she nearly fell apart, when she wanted to give up. Reading those words, I felt anger rise inside me, a silent rage that I had traded my life so she could live hers. Yet she still stumbled. I reminded myself I had done this for the children, not for her, but the bitterness seeped through all the same. I began to write back, though my responses were shorter. I told her I was fine even when I was not. I told her not to worry even when my nights were sleepless. I encouraged her, praised her, reminded her of the children's needs. My letters became a performance of strength because I could not allow her to see the cracks. If she saw my suffering, she might falter, and if she faltered, everything I had sacrificed would unravel. Sometimes I wondered what the guards thought as they watched us clutch our mail, as if those thin envelopes were treasures. Perhaps they knew the power of words, the way they could carry a person out of their cage for just a few moments. I often caught other women reading their letters with tears streaming silently down their faces, their hands trembling. We all understood that paper and ink carried more weight than chains. As the years stretched on, the letters began to change. The children's drawings became more detailed, their handwriting steadier. They wrote their own short notes, saying they loved me, but always in a distant way, as though I were a relative living far away, not someone they once hugged good night. Their innocence shielded them from the truth, yet each note sliced me with the reminder that they were growing up without me. Her words, too, shifted. In the beginning, they were frantic, soaked in guilt and fear. Later, they grew calmer, steadier, as if she had begun to accept the arrangement. She no longer apologized as often. She no longer lingered on the past. She wrote about school schedules, about birthdays, about normal life. To her, my sacrifice had become background noise, a constant hum she had learned to live with. To me, every word was a reminder of the silence I endured, so she could move forward. In the quiet hours of the night, I held those letters and asked myself questions I could never answer. Had I truly saved the children, or had I only destroyed myself? Did they need her more than they needed me, or had I stolen my own chance at happiness for nothing? Each envelope was both lifeline and dagger, proof of the life I had preserved and evidence of the one I had lost. The letters from home became my scripture, my torment, my anchor. I lived through them, suffered through them, and clung to them as though they could bridge the unbridgeable distance between my cell and the world outside. Each sheet of paper carried both love and betrayal, hope and despair. And though I never spoke the words aloud, I knew that every time I unfolded one of those fragile envelopes, I was unfolding the very reason I remained behind bars. When the gates finally opened for me, the world outside felt unreal, as if I had stepped out of one life and into another that no longer belonged to me. I carried my belongings in a cardboard box, the same way so many others did on their last day. Inside were fragments of the years that had passed, folded letters with creases worn thin, a few drawings on crumpled paper, a small book with notes scribbled in the margins. It was not a collection of possessions, but a collection of ghosts, each item reminding me of time that could not be reclaimed. The air struck me first. It was fresher, colder, sharper than the recycled oxygen inside the prison walls. The wind touched my face with an intimacy that startled me, and I stood frozen on the concrete steps just to feel it, as though I had forgotten what freedom smelled like. The sky stretched above me, wider than any barred window had ever allowed, but even under that vastness, I felt small, hesitant, like a trespasser in a world that had moved on. Linda was there waiting. She leaned against her car, her figure thinner, her face lined with years of strain. Her hair was streaked with gray now, tied back in a way that seemed more practical than stylish. She smiled when she saw me, but the smile faltered as quickly as it appeared. I walked toward her slowly, each step heavy, uncertain. When we embraced, her arms felt stiff, her body tense. It was not the embrace of two sisters reunited. It was the embrace of two strangers bound by a secret neither dared to name. The drive back was quiet. I watched the scenery blur by, fields and buildings that seemed both familiar and foreign. Billboards advertised products I did not recognize. Shops carried names that meant nothing to me. The world outside had changed its skin, leaving me behind. I felt like a relic being returned to a museum that no longer displayed the past. Linda's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her eyes fixed on the road, as if looking at me for too long might shatter her composure. Her house came into view, a modest place with paint peeling on the porch rails, a yard littered with toys faded by the sun. I had seen it only in fragments described in her letters, but now it stood in front of me as solid proof of the years she had lived while I had been gone. The children, no longer small, no longer innocent, were waiting inside. My heart pounded as I stepped through the door, and their eyes met mine with a mixture of curiosity and distance. They were teenagers now, their faces sharper, their bodies taller, their voices deeper. They did not remember me as I had once been, the aunt who tucked them in or brushed crumbs from their faces. To them, I was a name, a story whispered, a relative they had known more in absence than in presence. Their polite greetings carried none of the warmth I had clung to in my imagination. I smiled at them, but it felt fragile, a mask over the hollow ache in my chest. The house was filled with life I could not touch. School books lay scattered on the table. Photographs lined the walls. Laughter from the television spilled into the room. I stood among it all like an intruder, absorbing the rhythms of a family that had carried on without me. My sacrifice had preserved this home, yet it had erased me from it. The children looked at Linda as the center of their world, as the one who had been there every day, through every scraped knee and every school project. I had been replaced by her presence, by her survival. That night I lay awake in the small room she offered me. The walls were painted a soft color, but they felt as blank as my cell had once been. I listened to the muffled sounds of the household settling for the night, the creak of floorboards, the faint murmur of voices, the closing of doors. It should have comforted me, but instead it pressed on me like a weight. I was free, yet the freedom felt counterfeit, wrapped in silence and distance. The following days passed in a blur of small gestures. Linda made coffee in the mornings, leaving a cup for me on the counter. She asked about my health, about how I was adjusting, though her eyes never lingered on mine. The children included me in conversations, but always with politeness rather than intimacy. They asked about my time away with the careful curiosity of people who sensed boundaries they should not cross. Every word reminded me of the gulf between us, carved not just by years, but by truth. I walked the neighborhood alone, tracing streets that had once been familiar. Houses had been repainted, trees had grown taller, neighbors had moved away. Strangers passed me without recognition, their lives untouched by mine. I had once been part of this world, yet now I moved through it like a shadow. Freedom felt less like a gift and more like exile, a constant reminder that time outside had continued without waiting for me. Linda tried to fill the silence with reassurances. She spoke of plans, of starting fresh, of moving forward, but her words felt rehearsed, brittle, as though she was speaking not to me, but to the guilt that followed her. I watched her hands shake when she lit a cigarette on the porch, the way her shoulders tensed when our eyes met. The bond we had shared as children, as sisters, had fractured beyond repair. Every glance between us carried the weight of the secret we both lived with, the truth we both feared to confront. The children's lives stretched ahead of them, bright and unbroken, and I reminded myself that this had been the purpose of everything. They were the reason I had stepped into the courtroom, the reason I had carried the sentence. Their futures had remained intact, even if mine had been shattered. Yet knowing this did not ease the ache. I had imagined their love would greet me like sunlight after years in darkness, but what I received instead was distance, politeness, and a kind of pity that stung more than rejection. I realized then that my return was not a return at all. It was an entry into a world where I no longer belonged. The home I had saved had no space for me. The family I had preserved looked at me as though I were a ghost walking among them. I had given my life away, and now I stood holding only the hollow echo of sacrifice. The gates had opened, but the walls remained inside me. I carried them with every step, every look, every silence that stretched between us. I had returned, but I had not come home. The word redemption had sounded distant to me during the years behind bars, something reserved for sermons in the prison chapel, something abstract that belonged to others, not to me. I had thought redemption would arrive like a thunderclap, with light breaking through clouds, with applause, with forgiveness handed down from someone else's lips. But when I finally stood on the outside, when the silence of my sister's house pressed against me and the years lost weighed on my shoulders, I realized that redemption was not something given. It was something I had to carve out of the ruins myself. At first, I wandered. I walked the streets of the town where I had once lived, my shoes carrying me past familiar places now made strange. The bakery where I used to buy rolls on Sunday mornings had new owners, its windows painted bright with advertisements I didn't recognize. The library where I once sat for hours with ledgers and tax forms had been renovated, its old wooden tables replaced by computers glowing with blue light. Time had erased my fingerprints from every corner. I was no longer part of this place, and yet I still walked it, searching for pieces of myself. It was not forgiveness I wanted. My sister's children, nearly grown, regarded me kindly but distantly, like a figure from an old story. My sister herself spoke to me with practiced gentleness, her words coated in the varnish of obligation. I could not find redemption in their eyes. The sacrifice I had made had secured their lives, but it had also hollowed mine, and nothing they offered could fill it. I knew I had to find my own meaning, something beyond the shadow of what I had given away. I began to write again, not letters this time, but pages filled with memories. I bought a cheap notebook at a drugstore and filled it slowly, each word like a stone lifted from my chest. I wrote about the courtroom, the prison, the nights when silence was the only companion I had. I wrote about the drawings I had taped to my wall, about the ache of mail call when no letter arrived, about the moments when despair nearly swallowed me whole. The ink bled into the pages, black and unyielding, but in those words I saw the outline of a voice returning to me. Eventually, I found myself in a church basement on a Tuesday evening, standing in front of a circle of metal chairs. A local group had invited me to speak, people who worked with families of the incarcerated. My hands trembled as I unfolded my pages, my heart hammering as I looked into the expectant eyes of strangers. I told them my story, not the secret truth, but the shape of my life as it had been lived. I spoke of the weight of prison, of what it meant to be judged not only by a court, but by silence itself. The words cracked at first, rough from disuse, but then they grew steadier, carried forward by a force I had not felt in years. When I finished, the room was quiet, not with indifference, but with understanding. People nodded, some wiped their eyes, others simply looked at me as if they saw me for the first time, not as a criminal, not as a shadow, but as a human being who had endured. It was not absolution, but it was something close. In their silence, I felt seen, and that was the beginning of my redemption. I kept going back. Week after week, I spoke to small groups, church circles, community centers, schools. I told them about the system, about the weight of choices, about the way prison reshapes not only the guilty, but the families left behind. I spoke not with bitterness, but with truth, carrying my scars like proof. Each time I spoke, the burden grew lighter, not because the past changed, but because I had changed. I was no longer silent. In quiet moments, I returned to the river that ran along the edge of town. I had walked by it in my youth, but now I stood on its banks with a different kind of reverence. The water moved endlessly, carrying leaves, branches, reflections of clouds. I watched it and thought about time, how it flowed whether we noticed or not, how it never waited for anyone. I let myself believe that redemption was like that water, not sudden or miraculous, but steady, carving its way forward even through stone. My sister avoided those talks at first, but one evening she appeared, standing at the back of the room. She listened as I spoke about resilience, about endurance, about survival. Our eyes met for a brief second, and in hers, I saw the weight of years. She looked away quickly, but I knew she had heard me. I did not need her apology anymore. My redemption did not depend on her acknowledgement. It depended on the voice I had reclaimed for myself. Redemption also lived in small acts. I volunteered at a shelter, folding blankets, serving meals, listening to stories that mirrored fragments of my own. I sat with women newly released, their eyes wide with the same disorientation I had felt, and I told them that survival was possible. I watched their shoulders relax when they realized someone understood. In those moments, I felt a spark of worth return, fragile but real. I understood then that my sacrifice had not been the end of my story. It had been the beginning of a harsher, truer one. I could not erase the years lost, nor reclaim the life that had been stolen by my own choice, but I could shape what remained. My redemption was not in what others gave me, but in what I chose to create out of the ruins. Some nights I still lay awake, the memory of bars pressing into my mind, the sounds of keys rattling echoing faintly in my ears. But when I rose in the morning, when I walked to the community center or to the riverbank, I carried something different inside me. Not freedom as others knew it, not peace untouched by scars, but a quiet strength that belonged entirely to me. That was my redemption. The act of standing, of speaking, of breathing life into a voice that had once been silenced. It was not perfect, not complete, but it was mine. And after years of living for someone else's survival, having something that belonged only to me was enough.